My slide now. Please notify if you don't. I would like to start my talk with presenting to you one of the most famous philosophers of the early modern period, John Locke. Now, John Locke is mostly known for his essay concerning human understanding, and his famous letter concerning toleration is still used in education today. Less well known, however, is Locke's career as a physician. And even less well known is Locke's own experience with deafness. Locke was one of many who, during his lifetime, had to cope with hearing difference. It began in 1701 when Locke suffered from a chill, bringing about asthma and bronchitis. A few weeks later, he suffered from a violent earache, and his friend and colleague, Dr. Alexander Geeky, treated him with an application of a large roast onion wrapped in colewort leaf made into a poultice. At some point, deafness ensued. Dr. Geeky tried various treatments to soften the earwax, but to no effect, alas. James Tyrrell recommended wool rubbed with musk, and Locke's own mother suggested the gravy from 1 pound of lean beef to be injected in the ear. Nothing worked until suddenly Locke's pain and deafness was relieved when an internal abscess burst spontaneously. The doctor was well pleased to hear the eruption of the matter, and he advised Locke to clean his ears with rose water, tincture of myrrh, and aloes made with brandy. Dr. Geeky also sent Locke a silver ear trumpet, which he used for the duration of 1 month. Now, as it turns out, bodily fluids in relation to auditory perception have a rich medical history. From the late 17th century onwards, physicians grew increasingly interested in deafness, not just in the education of deaf-mute children, but also hardness of hearing in adults. In my talk today, I will analyze how early modern physicians delved into the fluids of the ear, from earwax, but also mucus in the eustachian tube. I will argue that this new focus on the fluids brought about a new understanding of auditory perception, which reconstructed hearing and deafness not in terms of a dichotomy, but in terms of a broad, continuous spectrum. And by doing so, I hope to offer a fresh perspective on the study and treatment of hearing loss in the early modern world. And I argue that there was no strict dividing line between deafness and hearing. If anything, that dividing line was very permeable and unstable. Now, historians have already described how in this time frame a dramatic shift occurred in the way people perceived those with deafness. Because in medieval times, generally speaking, congenital deafness was often seen as an unfortunate fate or divine punishment, leaving deaf-mute children isolated and secluded. But in the 18th century, teachers developed forms of sign language and speech therapy and established the schools for the deaf. Yet exactly why deafness gained so much attention remains an open question. And some historians, such as Susan Plan and Jonathan Rhee, argue that religious convictions motivated clerics to sympathize with the deaf. Other historians, such as Adam Kendon and Sophia Rosenfeld, place the use of gestures in the context of enlightenment and the ideal of Bildung, as well as in philosophers' fascination with the origin of language. But in my talk, I will propose yet another explanation, namely the growing interest in deafness by physicians and natural philosophers. Profound deafness and hardness of hearing, either by old age or accident, fell under the same rubric of deafness. So they used this word for all kinds of types of deafness. Medical studies, therefore, included such diverse things as ear anatomy, hearing physiology, defects of the ear, earwax varieties, but also the effectiveness of hearing aids, speech therapy, and gesture communication. And these physicians were convinced of the potential of those with hearing difference because of deaf natural philosophers who worked side by side, such as the French physicist Guillaume Amonton, the Dutch physician Abraham Cow, who was deaf, and English artist Sir Joshua Reynolds. Precisely because a certain level of medicalization occurred, early modern investigators contributed to changing perceptions of deafness, and that perception was less stringent and divisive, I would say. I'm aware that approaching deafness and disability from a medical perspective can be a sensitive issue. Since the 1980s, disability studies scholars have dismissed the medical model of disability because medical model of disability interprets the condition of, for example, hearing loss and deafness as pathological, and that aims to remedy the impairment with, for example, hearing aids. The medical model is problematic because it treats disability as something to be fixed and cured, and in its essence to erase disability altogether. And so instead, scholars have called attention to the non-medical factors of disability and asked about people's own experiences. They argue that disability should be seen as a social construct supported by collective assumptions and attitudes. And the most clear example is the wheelchair user who, from a medical perspective, should be cured from his or her muscular disease. But from a social perspective, the fact that a building entrance is blocked or has a huge staircase makes, assumes an ableist society, excluding wheelchair users. So here you can see the perfect difference here in models. And so social model has done much good, including argue for civil rights and the recognition of sign language as the official language. In fact, just this month, the Dutch government has recognized Dutch Sign Language as an official language, finally. And yet, social model has also received some criticism in recent years because it ignores the real predicament that some disabled people can experience: chronic illness, impairment. They should somehow be incorporated. And scholars have therefore suggested a cultural model, arguing that disability is defined by time and culture. It is part of the human experience, and attitudes towards disability can teach us about society. And so my aim, the aim of my project in general, is to present a cultural model based on pre-modern times, showing how medicine was not static and timeless at all. It is, and as I will show you now, hugely fluid, in fact. And it can be helpful to delve into this in pre-modern notions of disability because it predates this binary between medical and social models. So in the rest of my talk, I will first begin with a few words about fluidity and deafness in pre-modern times. I will then discuss early modern investigations into earwax, but also sound waves and the catheterization of the eustachian tube. And I'm using sources from all over Europe. My main cast of characters, they come from France, from England, the Dutch Republic, and the German lands. And they were all well-known and lesser well-known physicians and surgeons and natural philosophers. I have interleaved the analysis of medical studies with concrete examples of deaf and hard of hearing people, and I will conclude by discussing how these findings are important for rethinking history of early modern science and medicine, as well as disability studies. So, one, the fluidity and deafness. What did people consider to be deafness in early modern Europe? And why do I propose the use of this word fluidity? I think fluidity is the main motif around which this talk revolves. And I show you here the definition of deafness is historically fluid. Early modern deafness was a fluid state, and finally, early modern deafness was rooted in the fluids. So to shortly explain these three propositions, I want to start with a short anecdote that might be insightful, namely from the 1740s, the man from Chartres. So in this year, there a 25-year-old man from Chartres in northern France had been deaf and mute his entire life. But one day he had his entire town perplexed when he suddenly started to talk. French surgeon Claude Nicolas Lecat reported the incident to the Royal Academy. And he said the man gave out that 4 or 5 months before he had heard the sound of bells and was exceedingly surprised at this new sensation. After this, a kind of water gushed from his left ear, and he heard perfectly well with both. In the months that followed, the man continued living as he had always done, work, go to church with his parents, etc. But privately, he practiced to utter words and ultimately broke the silence. Surgeon Lecat emphasized that this was not a case of miraculous healing, which had not been uncommon in medieval and early modern Europe. Rather, the man's transition from deaf to hearing had simply coincided with the secretion of excess fluid stuck in his ears.
Ruben, I need to interrupt you a moment. I'm sorry. I'm just wondering if the slides are supposed to be moving, because most of us are still looking at the first slide, and it's just occurred to me that perhaps they should have moved on.
Yeah, you should see this one. Do you see this slide?
I do see it now. Is that the same for everybody else?
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry. So the slides weren't changing while you were talking before.
Okay, then I'll quickly show them to you, and I'll leave them as this so that you can see. So this is John Locke, whom you will all recognize for sure. My main argument, a new focus on the fluids brought about a new understanding of auditory perception, which reconstructed hearing and deafness, not in terms of dichotomy, but in terms of a broad spectrum. These are the slides when I talked about historiography. So we have first cultural history of deafness, and I propose another one, namely medical history of deafness. And I also talked about deaf and disability studies, how we can see this dichotomy between medical model and social model, and that we want to move towards a cultural model. And I think one of the ways to do this is through medical history. The contents, so I start talking about fluidity, and then we'll move on to earwax, sound waves, catheterization, and then conclusion. And I was just talking about these 3 points, about fluidity and deafness, how I think the definition of deafness is historically fluid, how deafness can actually be seen as a fluid state, and that it was rooted in the fluids. So I use it both metaphorically and literally. This is just a view of Chartres in France. And here I have the quote. I think it would be very beneficial for you to see these, because sometimes long quotes can be confusing. So I was just sharing this story of Claude Nicolas Lecat, who reported to the Royal Academy of this deaf-mute man who after 25 years suddenly started to talk after a kind of water gushed from his left ear, and he heard perfectly well. Now this highlights these 3 points, and the definition of deafness, I'd say, is historically fluid. While today we may draw a clear divide between the hard of hearing on the one hand and the deaf, the profoundly deaf, and the sign language users on the other, I think it would be anachronistic to apply this to the early modern period. So here we have the terms we use today, the profoundly deaf and congenital deaf. Deaf can be a person who's born deaf, they are either given a cochlear implant and they use sign language. They can form a deaf identity, deafhood, and they might not even experience disability. They rather talk of deaf gain rather than hearing loss. In medicine, we officially still talk about hearing loss, which is defined in decibels. And there are different kinds. Conductive hearing loss, there's a problem transferring sound waves. Sensory neural hearing loss, when the root lies in the inner ear or in the sensory organ. Hearing loss can also be a combination of the two. But when we look at how deafness was used in pre-modern times, we only have these words really. So either people spoke about the deaf mute or the pejorative deaf and dumb for those unable to hear and speak. Deafness was also used for those who had hearing problems because of illness, because of an accident, because of old age. And so many of the physicians I've been reading, they use deafness and hardness of hearing interchangeably, which that doesn't make my job any easier. And until I thought about that, maybe it negates the strict divide as well. So not only is deafness historically fluid, it can also be seen as a fluid state. It's not necessarily fixed. On the contrary, it could appear very flexible. The man from case in point, but also John Locke, who could hear perfectly fine, had a period of earaches and deafness. They don't imply any functional limitation. Monsieur from Chartres continued working and going to church as he had always done, and John Locke continued corresponding as he had always done. And so deafness is not something fixed. It can actually be a fluid state. Finally, many early modern kinds of deafness came with all kinds of various appearances, particularly in the fluids. So Locke had a swelling that suddenly burst. The Mr. from Chartres had also a fluid gushing from his left ear. And so instead of ignoring these signs, physicians appear to have attributed great significance to these occurrences. Hardness of hearing was a fluid deafness, thought to be related to the fluids in the most literal sense. And in what follows, I'll see if I can make this bigger. Yeah. In what follows, I will delve into what these fluids were. And we start with the importance of earwax. Now, the case of earwax is the first example of the unstable divide between hearing and deafness, also known by the medical term cerumen. It is the yellowish, waxy substance secreted in the ear canal. Although it may not strike you as particularly interesting, but for 18th century physicians, it became one of the most important explanations for hearing difference. And the variability of earwax enabled it to cross boundaries between healthy hearing and hardness of hearing. And so here we have the title page of a treatise of the organ of hearing by Guichard Joseph Duvernay. Duvernay was a French physician and anatomist, and he was one of the first to elaborately describe the particulars of earwax. Duvernay was a member of the Académie Royale in Paris, and he gave anatomical demonstrations. And in his book, he not only treats anatomy of the ear, but also physiology of hearing and all kinds of ear diseases. Now, publishing about the anatomy of the ear is not new. Here we have a page from Andreas Vesalius's famous book from 1543, De Humani Corporis Fabrica. And in Renaissance Italy, his work started a productive series of anatomical investigations into the ear. And we see a few small pictures here. And these are actually the little bones from the middle ear. And many of Vesalius' pupils contributed to the accurate description of the parts of the ear. Yet anatomy did not give a clear explanation how hearing actually worked, or deafness for that matter. And Duvernay therefore built on the solid parts of the ear and added his observations of the fluid parts. And his work would remain important and was adopted by numerous medical professors throughout the 18th century, like Herman Boerhaave in the Netherlands, but also Albert von Haller in Göttingen in Germany, Morgani in Italy, and many others. So where did the earwax come from? And what was its function? Well, according to Duvernay, he described the structure of the outer ear and the ear passage and its outer layer of skin, and you see illustrations from his book here. And he said that in this outer layer of skin, there were numerous round follicles, and through short ducts, these glands secreted an oily substance, which anointed the skin and slowly turned more thick. It also grew bitter and it was inflammable. And by a simple experiment, it was proven that earwax was continuously being discharged. And so the experiment, for example, concerned taking a piece of black velvet and rub your ears with it 100 times an hour, and you'll find that throughout the hour you continue to wipe off traces of wax. So even though you clear out your ear, new wax is being produced. And so according to Duvernay, the function of earwax was twofold. First, its oily character preserved the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, preventing it from drying out and losing its tension. And second, the bitter property of earwax prevented filth and insects and other extraneous bodies from entering and hurting the eardrum. So the first function of earwax is, support healthy hearing. But earwax could also be harmful to the ear when it was too thick and in too great a quantity. Dried up earwax and dirt could block the ear passage, bringing about a heavy deafness or hardness of hearing. Duvernay recalled, "It is not long since that, searching out the cause of deafness in a person who had been afflicted with it many years before his death, I found in the auditory passage, about 2 lines from the eardrum, a small pellet, which was soft and pretty thick, with a considerable quantity of filth indurated, collected before it, and I don't doubt that this sort of deafness is very common." Now, earwax-related deafness was indeed not uncommon. I have this example from the 1670s, when eminent member of the Royal Society, Robert Hooke, recorded a case of hearing impairment in his diary. He particularly complained about tinnitus, the ringing or buzzing in his ears. In December 1672, he filled his ear with warm honey and wool and the oil of bitter almonds. But on New Year's Day in 1673, Hooke still woke up with a strange noise in the right ear, like a horn or bell. Dr. Carew finally, in the summer of 73, so that's 6 months later, Carew syringed Hooke's ears, which helped to fetch out a core of earwax. Hooke had no complaints about noise in his head for the next 8 months. And Duvernay hypothesized that the cause of earwax viscosity was to be found in the cold, which thickens the wax. The external ear was open to the elements after all. In addition, people with magnetic temperament, who were generally colder, were also prone to earwax accumulation. Now, as a remedy, Duvernay suggested the application of heat. So that's classic early modern medicine. Solve the problem by its opposite. So the stopping of the ear with thick wool and cotton was aimed at opening the pores and letting the substances flow. Injections and syringing grew to become very popular treatment. Surgeons and doctors commonly use milk, but also mineral waters and all kinds of decoctions. Duvernay also suggested an instrument if nothing worked. Here you see a nice example of an ear scoop or ear spoon. This one was found by archaeologists, and they date it from the 17th century. But medical museums have many other kinds of ear scoops as well. My favorite is this one. It has a toothpick and an ear spoon, both in the shape of a lute instrument. But we also have beautifully decorated ones made out of silver, and it also has a hole on top. So this might also have been used as a bodkin, taking some earwax out, and then you can use it, apply it to threads, and then use it in sewing and weaving. Now, earwax gained significant attention in the 18th century. Here you see an example of a newspaper sheet, or actually a big advertisement, to cure deafness by removing earwax. This is Margaret Searle, wife of the late Samuel Searle, and it's likely that there were numerous of barber surgeons and itinerant surgeons, selling their service of clearing people's ears. Now, today we may recognize the buildup of earwax as a simple case of conductive hearing loss. Yet around 1700, earwax was not confined to solely this type of deafness. As a fluid, it showed great friability. It could be more oily, it could be more hard, it could turn more bitter. And earwax flowed, therefore, in and between various hearing categories, from unobstructed hearing to deafness. And this transformed the meaning of deafness as well, not as something static and permanent, but potentially episodic, a point to which I will turn to later as well. Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with the expression of sound waves, and this expression made me start to think about, does it have something to do with the fluidity of hearing and deafness? And first of all, of course, it might be linked purely metaphorically, because also in early modern times, in many treatises on sound, we come across this metaphor of the sound wave. And the surgeon Leca, which I mentioned before, but also other physicians, they envisioned sound to propagate analogous to dropping a pebble on a smooth surface of water and its waves spreading out evenly into all directions. For example, Albrecht van Haller said, "Sonorous waves of the air flow much after the same manner as we see water, without air, transfer any impulse that is given to it." Now, this wave-like depiction of sound helped explain concepts of amplitude and noise cancelling. But surgeon Leca went one step further. This is his book, which I think I've already put on the slide before. Well, it was Claude Nicolas Leca was. This book was very influential, published in 1744, and within a few years it was translated into English. And one of the larger chapters in this book is on hearing. And in it he imagined sound itself literally as a fluid. As he explained, it is necessary then that the air which generates sound be composed of several species of fluids, more or less subtle, each of them endued with a property of producing the vibrations or the different tones of ure, mi, etc. In other words, Leca claimed that not the air, but various kinds of subtle fluids in the air transmitted sound by their vibrational motion. Leca effectively reconfigured hearing as a soundscape of fluids and waves. This meant that the entire concept of hearing was understood in terms of fluids. Unfortunately, Leca did not elaborate on this particular subtle fluid. What is it exactly? So far, I haven't found any empirical evidence that he presented. Nevertheless, Lacat's notion of sound and hearing as fluid corresponded with 18th century concerns about air in general, because the air was in fact identified as a fluid. In all respects, it behaves like a fluid. The wind flows, it can be hot and cold, moist and dry, it can have high and low pressure. And so the main professor in 18th century Netherlands, Jerome Gaup, he literally talked about that fluid, the air. And this fluid air had a direct impact on the health and illness of the body. So in his lectures, Gaup systematically discussed all noxious powers of the atmosphere, because the air could be hot, could be too hot and dry, exhausting the body. The air could be too cold and moist, diminishing the body's vital motions. And the particularities of the air were indeed taken very seriously, because the atmosphere, where it surrounds and penetrates the human body, presses it equally in every point in a manner of fluids. So here we see that the air outside is literally imagined as a fluid. And this was proven by patients who, because when air pressure dropped and the quicksilver in the barometer was about to drop, they would suffer from acute rheumatic pains. And rheuma literally means means stream in Greek. And besides diseases, also the sense of hearing was affected by air. Damp air in particular was thought to blunt the senses and dilute one's hearing. According to Gaup's colleague, moist air dampens the sound like in mist. Partly our bodies are weaker and hence can vibrate less. So apparently somehow humidity in the air obstructed the flow of Lacat's subtle fluids. And how this exactly worked is something to be investigated further. Now, in this time when fluids abound, it may not be surprising that also auditory perception was redefined in terms of fluids, namely in the nerves. So not only outside we have the subtle fluids in the sound waves, but also inside the body. Sound waves were subtle fluids in the nerves, and they traveled from the ear to the brain. Before, physicians talked about animal spirits, but now we see the use of nervous juices. So this notion of resonating and vibrating nerves, that remains popular, but it was now explained in terms of the flow of nervous juices. We see these nervous juices in the works of many physicians, including Duvernay, William Cullen, Albrecht van Haller. And these juices would be affected by the sound waves and then flowing to the brain, bring about sensory sensation, auditory sensations. And this theory was supported by anatomical observations as well. Boerhaave and Van Haller hypothesized that a fluid must be present in the nerves and in the labyrinths. And this was finally proven in 1761 by Domenico Cotugno. In the middle here you see depictions of the semicircular canals and the labyrinths. And these were filled with fluid, and Cotugno, the fluid is named after Cotugno, the liquor Cotuni. So in some medical sources clearly suggest that sound and hearing as fluids and waves were not just metaphors, they were envisioned in the literal sense. In a somewhat neo-humoral physiology, physicians understood the entire concept of hearing in terms of fluids, and they effectively reconfigured hearing as a soundscape of fluids and waves. Now, so far I've talked about earwax as both conducive to hearing and as something that could bring about deafness. I've talked about the subtle fluids and the nervous juices, important to transfer sound. My final example of fluid deafness is the opening of the eustachian tube, and it shows another example of fluidity of deafness, because surgeons started to attempt all kinds of treatments to ameliorate the experience of deafness. And so in case this is a picture from John Cunningham Saunders, and he has a very nice illustration of the eustachian tube. So here we have the outer ear canal, the middle ear, and this part, this is the eustachian tube, a narrow passage leading from the pharynx, the cavity behind the nose and mouth, into the cavity of the middle ear. Why was this tube important? Well, in 1724, French postmaster of Versailles, Edmond Gilles Guillot, claimed to have relieved his own deafness by syringing with water. His syringe was a tube of tin, bent at an angle and connected with a leather bag. He introduced this syringe into the mouth and behind the palate. He squeezed the bag to spray warm water in a thin stream into the cavity, and this is the start of eustachian tube catheterization. Now, physicians were well aware that obstructions of the eustachian tube could lead to deafness in normal circumstances. This tube was supposed to be only lightly covered by a subtle moist fluid, but the tube could be blocked by swellings in the throat. It could be blocked by a polyp in the nostrils, and its surgical removal of such polyps was usually sufficient to restore hearing. But in case of ulcers, quinsy, pus and mucus accumulated in this tube, shutting it up and retaining the air in the internal ear. This would interrupt the communication of tremors of the external air and the auditory nerve. So the sole solution in this case would be to expel this excess mucus. But how? Well, we can fight fluids with fluids. A number of surgeons in England and France, such as Archibald Cleland, Antoine Petit, and John Douglas, experiment with various types of catheters. And these syringes injected warm water in the tube, in the eustachian tube, to dilate it and let excremental matter be discharged. In 1754, British surgeon Jonathan Wathen tried his hands at this type of catheterization, and he reported the treatment of 6 patients. The first was a 40-year-old woman who experienced a considerable deafness, but as soon the internal meatus was injected, she instantly affirmed that she heard much better. Case 2 was a 50-year-old man, and he had deafness in both ears after having had a cold. Wathen injected the tube on one side and washed away a very considerable quantity of congealed mucus in little clots of a blackish color and putrid smell. As the patient regurgitated, he immediately heard what was said. Now, Wathen reported these cases and similar results. This was effective in another 3 cases, and only in 1 it wasn't. So with a success rate of 5 out of 6, Wathen was carefully optimistic about this treatment. Now, this eustachian tube catheterization was no panacea for all hearing ills, of course. Authoritative physicians such as Gerard van Swieten in Vienna and Giovanni Battista Morgani, they warned that if the swellings and the slime were caused by venereal disease, infections could eat away parts of the tube and the inner ear. The resulting scar tissue could bring about a concretion of the tube, resulting in a so-called incurable deafness. But nevertheless, medical understandings and treatment of congested eustachian tube was clearly one of fluid deafness. Morbid fluids like mucus were recognized as being literally responsible for onset of bad hearing. And technological innovations with syringes enabled amelioration. This new treatment could make deafness episodic rather than fixed and permanent. So in closing, we can draw the following conclusions on fluid deafness. First, fluids of the ear. Early modern fluids played an essential role in early modern understandings of both hearing and deafness. Whereas before, hearing was understood in terms of anatomy, and deafness was not really a topic of study. This shifted in the course of the 17th century. More and more medical physicians and surgeons and researchers, they studied hearing and deafness, and they pointed at the fluids as a model of explanation. And in my talk today, my talk is therefore built on the somewhat paradoxical premise that hardness of hearing was rooted in the fluids of the ear. Second, fluid boundaries between hearing and deafness. Rather than reinforcing a rigid binary of either hearing or deaf, the fluids of the ear were instrumental in problematizing the distinction between them. Fluids of the ear cross boundaries between hearing and deafness, streaming, accumulating, solidifying, and they were identified by medical researchers as the cause of hearing difference, either towards better hearing or towards increased deafness. And as I've shown in the case of sound waves and fluid airs, liquid metaphors were saturating the works of all these physicians. But fluidity of one's hearing went beyond the metaphor, and they were meant quite literally. Now, in future research, I hope to find out how this impacted popular perceptions of deafness. Now, finally, I want to make a point on disability in history and science, in history of science and medicine. I think the two fields, disability studies and history of science, can benefit from each other. Although I've limited myself to deafness today, more research could be done. Consider, for example, blind and deaf natural philosophers such as Guillaume Amonton, who invented measuring instruments, but also the Scottish geologist James Hutton, who used an ear trumpet. And beyond the biography of these scientists, disability was perhaps at the core of 18th century life sciences. Blindness and deafness were directly linked to questions about the origin of language, linked to the origins of observation and knowledge. And what is the role of the senses of knowledge production? Furthermore, history of science and medicine can add to disability studies, I think, and especially the history of disability. We don't always need to separate physical and cultural dimensions. In fact, I would argue that we should contest the boundaries of the category of disability itself, to return to disability as a social model versus medical model. Scholars often uphold this dichotomy, and they focus on disability solely as a social, tending to ignore impairment, assuming that because it's medical, it's objective, therefore timeless, universal, and hence independent of cultural context. Deafness tends to be perceived as a given physical condition that is merely treated in various social cultural contexts. But as I've tried to show today, also this medical model is changing and is also culturally determined. Now, in today's society, we continue to debate issues of diversity, and history of science and medicine can help break down rigid ways of thinking. I hope that through history, we can propose a more inclusive view of disability and deafness. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
And I invite everybody to turn their microphones on temporarily so that we can give Ruben a real clap.